our next speaker and our last speaker at this event to help close us out and to share the perspective that she's developed over years is Dr. Tina Chen, a distinguished professor from the Department of History at the University of Manitoba. As has been said by many of our speakers, this is a historical issue going back years, tying into many different facets. Dr. Chen has been named one of the top 100 most powerful women in Canada in 2021. Under her leadership, equity, diversity, access, and inclusion were integrated into the strategic planning initiatives and program review, as well as everyday administration processes at the University of Manitoba. She established equity and diversity as a central component of the portfolio in the Department of History and the faculty at large. As a scholar activist, she's long been committed to thinking within critical race theory, working towards anti-racism practices, and her leadership and her voice have been able to further amplify others over the years. She currently is a recipient of a teaching award to co-host the first course on history of race and anti-racism in the modern world at the University of Manitoba. I'm just going to unmute you, Dr. Chen. Thank you so much for your patience, and we're honored to have you close out the event today.
Well, thank you so much for having me join you. And thank you to everyone for sharing their stories. And I, in many ways, being able to join this event this evening, I think was exactly what was needed for me at this moment. I'm sure, like many of you, this has been a particularly difficult set of this week. And this month. And, I'm joining you here. I'm joining you from Winnipeg, which is Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Innu, Oji-Cree, Dene, Dakota people, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. And with many, and as Nolan began talking about relationships with their Indigenous communities, really frame our experiences, my experiences here in Winnipeg, and how I think through and experience questions of racism, but particularly anti-Asian racism, and just acknowledging that this week, as we're gathering and we're thinking about Asian Heritage Month, Indigenous communities are reflecting back on what now is a year from the time, a year and a couple of days from the time where the country as a whole became aware of the mass grave sites. Not to say that they weren't known before. We are here right now talking on the anniversary of the killing of George Floyd. We are seeing the cycles of violence, racist violence in Canada, North America. Tony, I thank you for sort of speaking to some of these events. And it feels, once again, that talk is just inadequate. And it feels in many ways like there really are no words at this moment. The cycles of violence and racism seem to keep, coming up. We talk, we share, and they continue. And, I think for me, it's really grappling with that, particularly, I think, once again, over the last 24 hours, trying to get my mind around what that means, and also the repeated calls to, do something. And I think what was really refreshing today is to, this is where I very much appreciate Nolan's opening comments, that in many ways, talk is doing something. It's building relationships. It's reminding us of the work that we do, and that we do that work in solidarity. And so I wanted to kind of close out a little bit with a few reflections, more than what I'm doing, but after listening to everybody, reflecting on a few of the themes that I think I've been hearing woven throughout people's different experiences and their own stories. And very much, hearing, and I'll take the words straight from Ryan, conversations keep dying on the table. And so what are we going to do about that? What are we going to do instead of one more report, one more set of actions that we hear from each other, but we don't really know who else is hearing and listening to, and how do we hold people accountable? But I'm also heard a lot of people reflecting on how do we build those solidarities, and how do we ensure that as we address anti-Asian racism, that we're really conscious of and always working against those frameworks of creating oppressions of hierarchies, that we are really aware of the way that different racisms come through interlocked systems of oppression, but that our liberation needs to be a shared liberation. And that if we don't think intersectionally, that we are in fact often offering up solutions that impact others negatively, that reinforce other forms of exclusions, of racism and oppression. And that, this makes it often seem like a bigger problem. But what I think we've heard today is when we think in those ways, we expand our circles of friends. We make new allies, we think differently, we chart a path forward that is not just about who we are in our own experiences, but how we work that in relation to others. And I think here I was, kind of very interested in just kind of picking up, I think, this theme also of allies and the communities. And the idea then that allyship, is friendship, but allyship is also about action, and it's about centering communities and allowing communities to decide when and how we get to be present in relation to their work. And so I think from here and these kinds of reflections of what I'm hearing people say and kind of thinking through these different themes about next steps, I did want to share a little bit of the work that I've been doing at University of Manitoba. And not really me. And so again, this is like, really, it's not me so at all as a person, but that I've had the great fortune over the last year of being involved in both of the national forums on anti-Asian racism. And so recognize many of you from those forums and have been able to, have an online, friendship, allyship developing through those. But thinking really about how those national forums created opportunities. So the one at UBC and the one hosted by Toronto Metropolitan University really created opportunities for wide-ranging, broad-based dialogue among activists, community organization, Asian Canadians, researchers, government bodies, really doing that work to empower us to share, advocate, and build networks through which we could continue this work of dismantling systemic racism and countering anti-Asian racism in its diverse manifestations. But one of the things that I think, we all left those, and any of those who participated, much like I think those who've joined us for this conversation, we often leave feeling affirmed. The work is sharing is cathartic, it's energizing. But much like we've heard this evening, that often leaves us with that question of, the future efficacy. So what impact and how can we make collective actions? So we're all aware of the work we're doing and how much work each of us is doing. And it's an absolute joy and sort of, it's a source of energy to hear what others are doing. But what do we need to do for next steps that will allow us to build, expand, and to sustain those relationships? Because we all get busy and we hope to sustain these relationships, and it gets more and more difficult. And so this is where I am extremely pleased because out of the efforts of all of you and the work you've done building these relationships of my colleagues, friends, allies in Manitoba and across the country, we have been able to convince the University of Manitoba to kind of commit to taking a leadership role in the next stage. And while we recognize the great impact of two national forums, the decision has been that rather than host another forum, what is actually needed, and I've heard this through many of the speakers, is somebody to actually get institutions to support the work of working groups that we need to coordinate nationally. And so that what we'll be doing is taking a slightly different approach to the next steps and establishing 6 national working groups on themes that we've identified. The community's already done that work through the forums. And I'm throwing this out here because all of you, and I hope we'll kind of be in touch and we'll sort of answer when these calls go out to different lists to participate in them. And here, for me, this goes back to the question, I think Pam raised it, but I'm sure others said it as well. The question that's been raised at all of the forums and all the discussions, can we really make change from within the institution? And is that where transformative change is going to take place? And, I would say mobilizing institutions to support communities to decide if, when, and how that change needs to be done is the crucial step. And so my hope here in the next stages is that the University of Manitoba will provide the resources, the support for community-based national working groups to do the work that we've identified needs to happen, to create those hubs, to create those networks, to ensure that the reporting mechanisms of Eliminate Hate, all of these groups as we think through all this work is being done. And we know that could have much broader impact if we simply, could be a little better resourced, a little better way to get started and to have those networks. So I'm really excited about that and really thinking about what it will mean for us to shift our mind as well to creating community resources, toolkits, creating those national networks in ongoing and sustainable ways. And in my mind, using the university's infrastructure and support systems to to ensure that we're not all doing that work in different ways, and recognizing that, you know, this is part of a anti-racist approach, that institutions need to recognize that they have benefit. They have these from different places. And so those of us who are located within them, I think that's one of the roles that we can take. We can sort of shift those and shift the idea. We've heard it on here that expertise is not in the university, it's in lived experiences, it's in the community. And so that universities need to learn from those. And this was certainly a theme that came out from Toronto Metropolitan University as they hosted the forum. We were all like, this is great. We can talk about racism in post-secondary institutions. We're really working through this, but we also have to recognize that the authority, the expertise doesn't exist in there. So those are kind of, you know, what I would like to offer up on the next, as the next steps. And also just to acknowledge that through all of this, we intend to work, and for me personally, but I think in these next stages, and I know all of those who've been involved along the way, acknowledging that the intergenerational, community-generated, and cross-institutional dialogues that have been at the basis of the forums on anti-Asian racism, that they've always situated and understood anti-Asian racism in this context of interlocked systems of oppression. And so that needs to remain the focus. And if we don't do that, we will simply, you know, be working against each other and being ceding ground to those systems of oppression. So I'm looking forward to, you know, this being my new family, as Nolan said, and that we will continue to build those relationships. And through Yusuf and Harik, I'll be, you know, sending out information on this so that hopefully everyone who's joining and would like to can join in these next stages.
Thank you so much, Tina. Again, one thing you said that really caught my ear and that I love is addressing the systems of oppression, because those are the same systems that we can transform into systems of liberation, particularly in academic institutions where there's an opportunity to be these hubs, these focal points for social change and improvement. The resources, the connections, the expertise, the ability, the power of youth that exists within these organizations across the country are really incubators for such change. So thank you so much for sharing those words of wisdom